A cheap roadside motel sounded like the perfect escape after a bitter argument with my girlfriend. But sometime after 2 in the morning, the empty room next door started making noises. And when I finally worked up the nerve to check inside, I found a note sitting on the TV waiting for me with a message asking me to check my bedside drawer. My ex-girlfriend, Vanessa, and I had the kind of relationship that could go from perfect to unstable one in under 5 minutes. We fought constantly, but somehow always convinced ourselves that one more trip, one more weekend together, or one more fresh start would magically fix everything. That weekend, we'd driven into the mountains outside hoping to reconnect. During the day, things actually felt normal. We hiked trails, stopped at scenic overlooks, and even laughed together for the first time in weeks. Then the second night happened. I don't even remember what started the argument. It was probably something stupid. But by midnight, shouting had escalated in the hotel room, loud enough that someone eventually banged on the wall to shut us up. That was the moment I realized I couldn't stay there another second. Instead of getting another expensive hotel room, I drove down the highway until I found this tiny roadside motel sitting beside an old gas station. The neon vacancy sign outside flickered so badly that half the letters kept going dark. Honestly, the place looked abandoned, but the guy at the front desk handed me a key for $50 cash, and at that point, I didn't care if the mattress was stuffed with newspaper. I just wanted to sleep. The motel itself was one long row of rooms facing the parking lot. Mine was near the end. As I walked toward it, I noticed the room beside mine had its door hanging wide open. The TV inside was on, casting this weird blue glow through the darkness. I slowed down for a second, expecting to see somebody inside watching television, but the angle blocked most of the room from view. I figured whoever stayed there probably forgot to shut the door. So I kept walking. Inside, my room actually looked surprisingly normal. Old furniture, floral blankets, stained carpet. One of those loud air conditioners that sounds like it's chewing rocks. But compared to sleeping in my car, it felt luxurious. I locked the door behind me, kicked off my shoes, and collapsed onto the bed while scrolling through my phone. For a while, everything seemed fine. Then I started hearing noises. At first, I thought they were coming from my television. Muffled voices, strange bumps, maybe a movie playing in the next room. But after muting my TV, the sounds continued. That's when I realized they were coming through the wall beside my bed. I sat there listening carefully. It sounded like arguing, then crying, then something like heavy scraping across the floor. I checked the time. It was a little after 2 in the morning. I considered calling the front desk, but honestly, I didn't want to be that paranoid guy complaining about noise in a cheap motel. Places like that are always loud. So I ignored it. I turned the lights off and tried to sleep. A few minutes later, I heard a thud. The wall beside my bed shook hard enough to rattle the framed picture hanging above it. I sat up straight. There was another heavy sound. Someone was pounding on the wall from the other side. I stared at it in silence while my heart started hammering in my chest. The noises stopped again. And for some reason, the silence felt worse. I told myself maybe somebody was drunk. Maybe a couple was fighting. Maybe someone needed help. That last thought stuck with me. So against every instinct screaming in my head, I got out of bed and walked outside. The neighboring room was still open. The TV still glowed blue inside, but now the entire room was completely silent. I stood there for a moment staring into the darkness. "Hello," I called. No one answered. I knocked on the open door. "You okay in there?" I asked, but no one answered. I should have left right then. Instead, I stepped inside. The room felt colder inside than outside. Not freezing, just unnaturally cold. The carpet smelled damp, like mildew and stale, heavy ash. I slowly moved farther in until I could finally see around the entrance wall. The bed was empty. So was the couch. There were no bags, no clothes, no people. The room was vacant. I just stood there confused while the blue light from the TV flickered across the walls. Then I noticed something attached to the screen. A yellow sticky note. I walked closer and peeled it off. Written in thick black marker were 4 words. "Check your bedside drawer." The second I read it, this horrible feeling hit me in my stomach, like every part of my body suddenly knew I wasn't alone in that room. I dropped the note immediately, and right then the drawer shook. I ran. I don't even remember turning around. 1 second I was standing there, and the next I was sprinting back across the parking lot. I slammed my motel room door shut, locked the latch, threw the chain across, and backed away, breathing so hard my chest hurt. My hands were shaking uncontrollably. I grabbed my phone and called Vanessa immediately. The second she answered, I started explaining what had happened. Halfway through the story, another loud bang exploded through the wall beside me. Vanessa heard it through the phone. That's when she stopped making fun of me. "You need to leave," she said instantly. "Right now!" I told her I was going to the front desk first because I wanted my money back. Looking back, that was unbelievably stupid. The guy working the desk looked annoyed when I burst into the office. I told him somebody was messing around in the room beside mine and that something was seriously wrong. But instead of reacting, he just stared at me strangely. Then he said something that chilled me to the absolute core. "There's nobody staying beside you," he said. I felt my stomach drop. He explained that both rooms next to mine were vacant. I told him that was impossible because I had literally just been inside one of them. So finally, looking irritated, he grabbed a master key and followed me back across the parking lot. The entire walk there, I kept expecting to hear noises again. But everything was silent. When we reached the room, the TV was off. The door was still open, but now the room was completely dark. The guy stepped inside first and turned on the light. There was nothing. I searched the TV for the sticky note, but it was gone. Then, almost mockingly, the employee bent down and checked the drawer himself. Nothing there either. At that point, he looked more annoyed than concerned. He told me there was no refund and suggested I get some sleep. There was absolutely no chance of that happening. I grabbed my stuff, got in my car, and drove straight back to the hotel I'd stormed out of hours earlier. I didn't even care about the argument anymore. For the first time in my life, sleeping beside somebody else felt safer than being alone. And to this day, I still think about that note, because whoever had left it there was certainly not playing with me. I stopped at a roadside motel because I was too exhausted to keep driving. The place looked deserted and lifeless. Only 2 cars in the parking lot. An old man at the front desk. A room that was barely locked. Then sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up freezing cold and realized somebody was standing by my window side. A few years ago, I was driving cross-country alone for work. I'd been on the road almost 10 hours that day, cutting through small towns and endless highways somewhere in the middle. By midnight, I was struggling to keep my eyes open. My vision kept blurring every couple seconds, and I caught myself drifting over the shoulder twice. I knew I needed to stop before I wrapped my car around a guardrail. That's when I passed through this tiny town. The whole place looked strange. Not dangerous, but empty. Most of the buildings downtown were dark, and the few stores still open looked like they hadn't changed since the 90s. Even the gas station felt abandoned. I drove around for a couple minutes before spotting an old motel. The lights on the giant sign dazzled boldly in the dark, and half the letters had burned out. The parking lot only had 2 other cars in it. That should have been enough to make me leave, but I was exhausted. At that point, I probably would have slept in the middle of the road if no one stopped me, but I parked and walked to the front office. The office sat in the corner of one of the motel buildings, with yellow light spilling through dusty windows. The second I stepped inside, I was hit with this horrible, humid smell. An old tabletop fan rattled loudly on the counter. Behind it sat this elderly man reading a newspaper. He didn't greet me, didn't smile, didn't even look up at first. I stood there awkwardly for a few seconds before finally saying, "Do you have any rooms available?" Without lowering the paper, he muttered, 65. That was it. No welcome. No explanation. Just 65. I handed him my card and asked if I could get a corner room since they're usually quieter. He finally lowered the paper enough to look at me and simply said, "No." Something about the way he said it bothered me. He handed me an old brass key attached to a blank keychain and pointed toward the parking lot without further instructions on directions. I walked back outside and found my room near the far end of the motel. The lock immediately gave me problems. The key barely fit, and I had to jiggle it around for almost 30 seconds before it finally turned. Even then, the door stuck so badly I had to shoulder it open. The room inside looked rough. There was this nasty smell lingering in the air like harsh disinfectant trying unsuccessfully to cover up a smell. The carpet used to be blue at some point, but now it was mostly grey from stains and wear. There was an old couch against one wall, a tiny coffee table, and a bed that looked older than I was. I almost turned around and asked for another room. But honestly, judging from the condition of the place, I doubted any room there would be better. So I shut the door and tried locking it behind me. That turned into another struggle. The lock refused to catch properly. I kept twisting the key, pushing the door inward, pulling it back, trying everything. Eventually, something inside the mechanism snapped loudly. I froze. At first, I thought I'd completely broken it. But when I tested the handle, the door wouldn't open anymore. So I figured it was close enough. As long as nobody could get in, that's all that mattered. I changed into sweatpants, tossed my jeans onto the floor beside the bed, and tried turning on the television. Of course, the remote didn't work. I remember laughing to myself at how perfectly terrible the place was. Then I climbed into bed and shut off the lamp. I must have been half asleep already because the sound nearly launched me out of the mattress. Something hit the window beside the bed. I jerked upright and looked over. A man was standing outside staring directly at me through the glass. I felt my heart rate spike up instantly. He looked disheveled and sweaty, maybe even injured. "Please," he said through the window. "Please help me. I'm in serious trouble." His voice sounded desperate, but something about it felt wrong. I can't explain it better than that. Every instinct in my body told me not to open that door. I shouted back through the glass, telling him to go to the front office, but he stayed there. "Please, man," he kept saying. "Please just let me in for 1 second." The longer he stood there, the more nervous I became. Finally, after I ignored him long enough, he slowly walked away into the darkness. I waited several minutes before finally getting up to peek through the curtains. He was gone. That incident rattled me more than I wanted to admit. I immediately checked the door again, pulling hard on the handle to make sure it still wouldn't open. Then I shut the curtains tightly so nobody could look inside anymore. Eventually, my exhaustion caught up with me again. I drifted into this weird half-sleep, where I dreamed I was wandering through an empty grocery store while somebody chased me through the aisles. At some point during the dream, I started hearing this clicking noise. The sound kept getting louder until it completely took over the dream. Then suddenly I woke up. The room felt freezing cold. At first I couldn't figure out why. Then I noticed that the man was standing by my window. The window was cracked open and he was about to enter. I yelled like my life depended on it, and the man took off running. I didn't wait a second longer. I shoved a chair under the doorknob and immediately called my older brother. I remember whispering because I was terrified the guy might still be nearby listening. My brother stayed on the phone with me for almost an hour while I packed my stuff. He kept telling me to leave immediately and not even bother arguing with the motel owner. But before leaving, I still went to the front office. The old man was sitting there in the exact same spot reading his newspaper like nothing had happened. I told him somebody had entered my room during the night. For the first time since I'd arrived, he actually looked nervous. He replayed footage from one of the security cameras facing the parking lot. The video showed a man wearing a baseball cap and some kind of face covering walking directly to my room, like he had been watching which room I'd entered. The creepiest part? The guy never even tried another door, just mine. I got my refund, threw my bags into the car, and drove almost 2 hours before finally stopping again. I ended up sleeping in my car at a crowded truck stop with all the doors locked. I barely slept at all, because every time I closed my eyes, I kept seeing that silhouette standing by my window watching me. My husband and I were helping deliver supplies to a flooded town when we ended up stranded for an extra night. The only place with an available room was an isolated motel beside a lifeless lake. The owners acted strangely the second we mentioned the nearby trailer park. Then at exactly 1:15 in the morning, somebody started whispering outside our door. A few minutes later, we heard scratching coming from inside the bed. This dates back to last year, around February, when my husband and I volunteered to help with cleanup efforts after severe flooding hit a small rural town nearby. Entire neighborhoods had been heavily impacted. Roads were still covered in dried mud, and a lot of families had lost almost everything inside their homes. Our church gathered donations for the area, so my husband and I drove down with a truck full of clothes, canned food, blankets, and cleaning supplies. Originally, we only planned to stay one night, but after spending all day helping unload supplies and clear debris from damaged homes, we realized there was no way we were making the drive back that exhausted. The first night, we stayed at a decent hotel near the coast with a view of the water. It wasn't fancy, but compared to what came afterward, it felt like paradise. The next morning, we continued helping with relief work, delivering supplies to neighborhoods farther inland. That's when everything got delayed. One of the roads leading out of town had partially collapsed from the flooding, forcing traffic into a massive detour. By the time we finished for the day, every decent hotel nearby was completely booked. My husband searched online for almost an hour before finally finding one place with an open room. When we pulled onto the property that evening, the first thing I noticed was how isolated it was. The motel sat beside this enormous lake, surrounded by thick trees and marshland. The water looked black under the evening sky, perfectly still, like nobody had touched it in years. About 100 yards away sat a small trailer park, partially hidden behind overgrown weeds and grass. The entire area felt abandoned. There were only 3 vehicles in the motel parking lot. My husband immediately muttered, "This place looks like the perfect spot to shoot a dark thriller." Honestly, he wasn't wrong. The front office lights were dim, and several bugs buzzed endlessly against the windows. Inside, we were greeted by an elderly woman with short grey hair and a warm smile. She was surprisingly friendly compared to the place itself. She checked us in while casually talking about the flooding and how the lake behind the motel had finally filled up again for the first time in decades. Apparently, it had nearly dried out years ago. Then her husband walked into the office. The atmosphere changed instantly. He was tall and painfully thin with deep wrinkles hanging from his face. Dark circles surrounded his eyes like he hadn't slept in weeks. But it was the way he stared at us that bothered me most. It wasn't angry, but it wasn't welcoming either. The woman introduced him, but he never said a word. He simply stood behind the counter staring silently while she handed us our room key. The second we walked outside, my husband looked at me and said quietly, "That guy gives me bad vibes." I agreed immediately. Neither of us wanted to spend any more time at the motel than necessary, so instead of settling into the room, We drove into town to grab dinner. We ended up eating pizza at this tiny sports bar before catching a late-night movie nearby just to kill time. By the time we finally returned to the motel, it was fully dark outside, and somehow the place looked even worse at night. The lake reflected almost no moonlight. The trees surrounding the property swayed in the wind, making these creaking noises that sounded almost human. As we unloaded our bags from the truck, my husband noticed one leftover donation bag buried beneath some boxes in the truck bed. It contained clothes we'd forgotten to drop off earlier. He suggested giving it to somebody at the trailer park nearby since we'd be leaving early the next morning anyway. At first I agreed, but the closer we got to the trailer park entrance, the more uncomfortable I started feeling. The place was completely dark, with rows of trailers sitting silently in the darkness. I suddenly stopped walking and turned back toward the motel. My husband noticed immediately. "What's wrong?" he asked. "I don't know," I admitted. "This feels weird." Maybe it was because of the horror movie we'd watched earlier. Maybe exhaustion was getting to me. Either way, neither of us wanted to walk through that trailer park at night anymore. So we carried the bag into the motel office instead and asked the old man if he could pass the clothes along to somebody there. The reaction we got was immediate. The old man's expression changed completely. His eyes widened, then he shook his head hard. "No," he said sharply. "Absolutely not." My husband looked confused. "It's just clothes." I said no. The man said with a slightly more agitated voice. The old man glanced nervously toward the dark trailer park outside the window before backing away from the counter. "There's no reason to go over there after dark." Then he walked into the back room without another word. My husband and I just stood there staring at each other. Even the old woman suddenly looked uncomfortable. We took the clothes back to the truck and decided we'd donate them somewhere else later. Neither of us spoke much after that. Something about the interaction deeply unsettled both of us. Back inside our room, we showered and tried relaxing for a while before bed. The room itself wasn't terrible, but there was this strange, damp smell lingering in the air. And every now and then, I thought I heard faint noises coming from inside the walls. Around midnight, we finally turned off the lights and tried sleeping. At some point during the night, I woke up suddenly. My husband's snoring filled the room. I checked my phone. It was 1:15 a.m. I rolled over, trying to fall back asleep, when I noticed light shining beneath the door. At first I assumed it was headlights from a passing car. Then I heard whispering outside, too muffled to understand. I froze instantly. The whispers continued for several seconds before stopping completely. Then came the sound that made my stomach turn cold. The doorknob rattled like somebody was testing whether the room was locked. I didn't move. I just stared at the door while my heart hammered against my ribs. After a few seconds, the blue light disappeared. I stayed frozen for what felt like forever, before finally waking my husband and whispering everything I'd heard. Instead of panicking, he surprised me by quietly laughing. Then he leaned closer and whispered back, "So you heard weird stuff too?" I frowned. My husband explained he'd been awake earlier because he kept hearing scratching noises nearby. At first he thought it was rats inside the walls. He slowly raised a finger to his lips. "Listen." The room went silent. Then we both heard scratching sounds in the bed frame directly beneath us. I jumped out of bed so fast I nearly fell over. My husband was already grabbing his keys. Neither of us said another word. We left everything else exactly where it was. Our room key, chargers, half-unpacked bags. We quietly walked outside, climbed into the truck, and drove away from that motel that very same morning. Neither of us looked back. And to this day, whenever I think about that place, one question still bothers me more than anything else. What exactly was hiding underneath those beds? If you enjoyed these motel horror stories and want more creepy, true encounters, abandoned places, and late-night nightmare fuel, make sure you subscribe to Deep Horror channel. Turn on notifications so you never miss a new upload, because the next story might make you think twice before checking into another motel alone at night.